Hello, and welcome to Fixing 5e, the series where I redesign the entirety of D&D 5e as a completely free and open access system I call Freedom Fantasies. Links to the full system in the description below, but let's talk Weapon Masteries. Today I have an axe to grind with Weapon Masteries. This is a new system introduced in playtest 5 of the Unearthed Arcana for 1D&D, and this is a system which is designed to enrich the experiences of players who are playing martial characters. At some point I felt I would need to incorporate this system into my redesign. However, there's a big problem. I don't actually want this system in my game, because Weapon Mastery has some of the worst game design I've seen come out of the design team during the 1D&D playtest process. I know this opinion is going to be contentious. This is the first power boost that martials have been given by the good and benevolent Jeremy Crawford and his design team in years. How dare I say that Weapon Masteries are bad when it is there as a way to help close that martial caster gap. So, before I get into my beef with this system, I am going to get into what is actually good about Weapon Mastery. Not only this, I'm also going to be giving my redesigned version of Weapon Mastery in my next video. Because what's the good in complaining about a system and not offering an alternative? So, let's get into it. What is good about Weapon Mastery? Number 1. It creates interesting and powerful options. Weapon Masteries offer martial classes the ability to do something more interesting on their turn beyond just using the attack action. So often the turn of a fighter, barbarian or even a monk is reduced to I run up to an enemy and poke them in the hopes that they will stop moving. It lacks a lot of the potential drama and tactics we imagine in sword fighting scenes, and it achieves nothing beyond reducing the hit points of the monster you're fighting. Weapon Masteries, however, allow characters to do a few different things. Depending on the weapons the character is wielding, they might be able to slow down the enemy, they might be able to impose disadvantage on the enemy's next attack, or they may even offer the chance to knock them prone. Not only are these interesting effects, but also the effects themselves are contributing meaningfully to the power that these classes wield, helping to narrow that wide gap in power between martials and casters. Because of this, Weapon Masteries do materially add some added interest to the martial character's turn, and they are also helping increase their power. Number 2, it helps create a fantasy. The next advantage is that Weapon Masteries provide a way for weapons to feel distinct from one another. When you're fighting with a longsword, a battle axe or a warhammer, the only actual difference between those weapons is the type of damage they're dealing, which 99% of the time makes no actual difference to the combat. And then some weapons like the glaive and the halberd are literally the exact same weapon, just with a different name. Weapon Masteries, however, gives characters the fantasy of actually feeling like they're getting the most out of using a particular weapon. It rewards players for using a specific weapon with the fantasy that they are able to get more out of that particular weapon. And often these Weapon Masteries are evocative of certain styles of fighting. From the more brutal fighting of a character with cleave or graze, able to damage additional enemies or just reliably do damage to an enemy irrespective of hitting. And then we've got the more tactical approach of something like Vex, which puts, it feels like it puts pressure on the characters that the character is attacking, granting that person advantage on subsequent attacks against them. And then we've got point number 3, customization. Weapon Masteries provides a much needed way to customize martial classes beyond just their choice of subclass. Spellcasters have literally hundreds of spells to choose from as they level up, providing them with countless ways to build their character. Meanwhile, martials are being awarded as many as 9 whole different Weapon Mastery options to choose from, which, okay, maybe that's not quite as many as the hundreds that spellcasters get, but nevertheless it is at least introducing a new way to customize those classes. Okay, so having very briefly covered what's good about Weapon Masteries, I'm sure people in the comments below will inform me of other points I've missed. Let's get into the bad, the really, really bad about Weapon Masteries. Point number 1, it slows down the game. My first and biggest gripe is that Weapon Masteries slow down combat. Let's discuss some examples. The biggest and most obvious offender is the topple Weapon Mastery. Each and every time you hit with a weapon that has the topple Weapon Mastery, it provokes a saving throw from that character. This effectively doubles, probably a bit longer, in fact, it doubles the length of time that a single attack is taking from deciding to make the attack to resolving the dice rolls. And then we've also got options such as Cleave, where we're adding an additional attack to every turn, effectively, provided they meet certain requirements. And then we've got Weapon Mastery such as Sap and Slow, which require we track additional instances of disadvantage or reduced speed on a monster between turns. And then we've got Push, which allows a character to move another character repeatedly on their turn. And then there's Nick, which creates additional attacks as well, just like the Cleave Weapon Mastery does. Now, these all sound like great additional effects, and none of these are maybe on their own taking that long. However, if you consider that many of these, in fact I think all of these, are provoked on every single attack, and maybe about half the characters in the party are all using these features turn after turn, suddenly we're creating multiple additional effects every round of combat. And this is going to make a game where people are already complaining that combat takes too slow kind of grind to a slow crawl. Point number 2. Weapon Masteries isn't an optional system. Now, my next biggest complaint is that the system is both complex and entirely not optional. While many of us more experienced players may not see Weapon Masteries as a particularly complex system, we have to remember that many people who are coming into this game are very inexperienced. This might, for many people, be their first role-playing game. Systems as simple as making an attack roll, saving throw, and skill check are already a bit of a learning curve for these players. And yet now we're asking them to learn this additional system that's going to greatly affect how their martial characters perform in combat. Weapon Masteries isn't replacing an existing system, it's bolting an additional system on and asking players to accept the additional complexity that this system brings as the cost that must be paid to make martials more interesting and powerful. There's no opt-out from this mechanic where players can simply choose not to take Weapon Masteries and keep their character relatively simple by comparison. This means that those new players are having to face an even steeper learning curve, or maybe they're players who simply aren't interested in Weapon Masteries and what they have to offer and would maybe just prefer like an additional +1 to their character. Maybe they are just there to have a bit more of a relaxing time playing what they thought was going to be a simple class, as many people tend to go into the martial classes expecting. Point number 3, I think. Some masteries are just not as good as other masteries. Many masteries are simply not powerful enough. The obvious example of this is the Flex Mastery, which allows someone who's wielding a versatile weapon to go from using the smallest damage dice to the biggest damage dice they uses when they're just wielding it with one hand. This may sound like a power increase, particularly to the sword and board fighters. However, it completely does nothing for any character who's holding a versatile weapon in 2 hands. And in reality, that additional +1 damage isn't really going to stack up against a lot of the other benefits that other masteries offer, such as the Graze or Vex masteries, for example. Now, the power of these weapon masteries can potentially be fixed with some future balancing. However, I think there's actually something fundamental about how weapon masteries are being introduced that makes balancing them against each other pretty much impossible. And this is because all weapon masteries work on the logic that they must add an additional effect on top of the attack. And the reason weapon masteries can't be balanced against each other is because they have the same design philosophy, that they just add an additional effect on top of the original attack. This means that the power of an attack can only go up when we modify it with a weapon mastery. And the amount of additional power that each of those weapon masteries is going to grant is going to vary by the description of what a weapon mastery actually does. And it's going to be very difficult to balance one weapon mastery over another. How would you balance something like Flex, which is increasing the damage die on a weapon, for example, against something like Vex, which is granting advantage, or something like Graze that's providing automatic damage, or something like Topple, which is inflicting an additional status effect on something? If we wanted to balance an effect such as Topple against Flex, then what we'd really need to do is introduce some kind of penalty for using the more powerful effect of topple, such as maybe the initial attack roll is made at disadvantage, or maybe without its proficiency bonus. However, the attitude of the design team is that they can only add power with these weapon masteries, and they cannot at all remove it, because, well, that would make the satisfaction scores on these features bad, and they can't have players disliking something they do. Designing by committee in the way that 1D&D is doing really prevents the design team from making the kind of well-balanced mechanics that they need to in this game. Let's get into the fact that some of the weapon masteries are just broken. Vex, for example, makes gaining advantage a really cheap and easy process, and something like Graze actually completely upends the way in which guaranteed damage is supposed to work in 5e. Consider how cantrips work. Unlike leveled spells, they are all save or suck or rely on attack roll, such that the result is you either get some damage or you don't get some damage. And there's a good reason for this, because if you can deal guaranteed damage in 5e without expending some kind of resource, you create an exploit in the game. Consider if a character is able to maybe completely separate themselves off from an enemy's attacks for an extended period of time. If they've got a feature that allows them to round after round deal consistent damage, and all they have to do is wait out the clock on the enemy's hit points, then you've made a broken feature. You've made a combat which is really interesting to watch. No one wants to watch a combat last for 10 rounds just because you've somehow gamed the system. And then there's the other issue that weapon masteries like Vex and Nick are indispensable to a class like the Rogue, where getting the additional attack or the additional advantage of something is going to completely change how much damage they can do round after round. And then it doesn't really feel like they've got a reasonable choice as to how they're going to build their character. They're always going to have to go for one of those two weapon masteries, and this creates what's called an illusion of choice for the character. In reality, there's only going to be at best somewhere between 1 and 3 ideal choices for a character to go for that really make sense. Compare that with how spells are chosen. Now, there are a few particularly broken spells that pretty much all characters pick up. I'm thinking like Shield or the Conjure Animal spells. However, there's enough choices of spells that spellcasters can make, as well as enough different spells of relatively similar power, that even with 1 or 2 broken choices, those casters do have meaningful choices as to what spells they take. And this illusion of choice feeds into our last problem. Number 4, weapon choices. If there's only a few reasonably good weapon masteries for any given class to make use of, suddenly we have all characters from that class choosing the same few weapons, not because they have a particular fantasy that they have, but instead they're just picking the mechanically best weapons. And while it could be seen as a problem that the longsword, battle axe and warhammer in the current game are pretty much mechanically identical, at least in that iteration of the game, players felt free to go with the options that they liked the flavour of the most. Not only this, but making weapon masteries depend on weapon choices creates a huge problem down the line for DMs, where a player will in many cases want a specific weapon, either as loot or as a magical item, to fulfill a particular class fantasy that they want. And the DM may be unwilling to do that, or simply following a module which doesn't empower them to reward that kind of loot. It also creates weird issues with weapon swapping, where a player could potentially cycle through multiple weapons in a single turn to accomplish the extra effects of multiple weapon masteries in a single turn. While this may fill some people's class fantasies, it has the very gamey feel of a character able to pause the game and swap their equipped weapons just because they want to make use of more than one. Then, number 5, maybe, masteries are incompatible with other class features. And then we get into what really started my thoughts along the lines of weapon masteries being bad for the game. It just doesn't work with a lot of class features. Let's go back to the Rogue. With both Weapon Mastery and Cunning Strike, they have the ability to create multiple effects on an enemy in a single strike, potentially up to 3 different effects if you consider high levels their Cunning Strike is able to deal multiple effects. With something like a Battlemaster Fighter or Arcane Archer or the Monk, they can also stack Weapon Masteries on top of effects such as Battlemaster Maneuvers, Arcane Arrows and Stunning Strike, creating very powerful effects on a regular basis with only some resource cost. I think there's a good reason perhaps why we didn't see unarmed strikes being offered Weapon Masteries in the last playtest, because if they gained them, the game would grind to a halt, as a monk would be able to stack 4 or more effects during a single round of combat, right from low levels. Weapon Masteries which require a saving throw, like Topple, are in my opinion completely incompatible with a game where resource expenditure is generally required to create additional effects on top of an attack. And then we get into how Weapon Masteries actively hurt current features in the game that create advantage. Features like effects, and to an extent Topple, make all other methods of gaining advantage worthless by comparison. They also show a complete lack of imagination on the part of the game's designers. In a lot of recent game design choices, they've granted advantage through features like the Effects Weapon Mastery, the Champion Fighter's once per combat inspiration, and if we go back a bit further, there's the dreaded Silvery Barbs of Strixhaven. These mounting additional methods of gaining advantage completely de-incentivize a character, for example a Barbarian, from using their Reckless attack. Why use that feature when they've got so many other ways of creating advantage? And also, the more times you create a feature that grants advantage, the more kind of dilute each of those features gets in their relative impact on the game. I don't know, it also feels like it doesn't feel like a special feature anymore if you're kind of effectively gaining advantage every turn one way or another. It feels like it kind of cheapens the tactical choices in play. Oh, okay, I think I've complained for long enough. Before I close out this video, I am going to talk about how we can fix Weapon Masteries. Firstly, we need to find a way to introduce the idea of masteries without slowing down combat. In the case of something like Topple, where a saving throw is needed to cause the effect, we need to reduce the number of checks being made during that turn. As currently, you've got the initial attack that's being made by the weapon, and then the subsequent saving throw, which has the effect of more than doubling the length of time it takes to resolve the effect. So we could make something like the Topple effect happen on an attack roll automatically. I think we can all agree that that's probably going to be too powerful. The next thing we could potentially do is place a negative modifier on the attack. For example, maybe you have to make the attack with disadvantage to knock an enemy prone with that weapon. This would be better for the game's balance. However, it has the issue that it ignores the character's abilities. The reason why we want to use a saving throw for something like creating an effect on a creature, like knocking them prone for example, is because it takes into consideration that creature's abilities. They could be a giant with massive strength and strength saving throw that makes it more unlikely that they're going to be knocked prone, or we might be dealing with a legendary creature that has legendary resistances that they can use to prevent these debilitating effects on them. If we completely remove saving throws from the equation of inflicting powerful weapon mastery effects, then you ignore those creatures' abilities and you create a feature which is again going to be too powerful one way or another. Because of this, for an effect like knocking prone, I really feel like a saving throw is needed. And so if we can't remove the saving throw, I feel like we kind of move towards an unusual, but in my opinion, logical solution to the problem. I would recommend removing the attack roll altogether and replacing the attack roll with a saving throw. This way, the attack you are making is going to more closely resemble something like a cantrip, which you can use in place of an attack that you make on the attack action. If the creature fails their saving throw, then both the effect, such as the knocking prone effect, will occur, as well as some of the damage from the weapon, which can be resolved at the same time. Now, This process won't be as quick as a normal attack would be, since saving throws do require some back and forth between a player and the dungeon master. But it's a lot better than making two separate checks, which is what the current Topple Mastery does. In real terms, I think it's not unreasonable to allow a martial character's attack to take as long to resolve as a cantrip, since a typical spellcaster's turn will last about as long as maybe casting two cantrips might do, as they might have a effect that they're maintaining concentration on, as well as a cantrip that they're casting while they maintain that concentration. If we wanted to speed things up, however, we can introduce other restrictions. One common fix that people have suggested for the Topple Weapon Mastery, for example, is to limit it to happening once per turn. You can't just keep having monsters make saving throws against that same effect attack after attack. I think this is quite a reasonable restriction to put in place, especially when you're in the current system where you make an attack and a saving throw, and if you were just having the Weapon Masteries rely on saving throws, I also think it would be quite reasonable there. There's another benefit to why we might want to make it rely on a saving throw than an attack roll, and that is that it actually prevents the stacking issue that I mentioned with Weapon Masteries having with other class features such as Cunning Strike or Key Expenditure for Stunning Strike. If the weapon attack is a saving throw, it can't be stacked with something like Sneak Attack and by extension Cunning Strike. It also wouldn't stack with something like a Paladin Smites or the Crusher feat or the Battlemaster maneuvers or keypoint features like Stunning Strike. And while this might sound limiting to players, the fact is that if you allow Weapon Masteries to stack with all of these effects, players can potentially provoke 6 or more saving throws per a single round of combat, sometimes directed at a single enemy. And the truth is, these classes like the Rogue and the Paladin don't really need to have Weapon Masteries work in tandem with their features, because those features, Cunning Strike and Weapon Masteries, are doing that legwork of creating the interesting additional effects that those classes can do. Not only this, I don't think all Weapon Masteries would necessarily need to rely on a saving throw. I think that if the effects are relatively small in their effect and aren't the kind of effects which must take into account what the creature's abilities are, then these could just be additional effects that we create, maybe at a small penalty to the attack itself. For example, taking the proficiency bonus away from an attack roll. I see saving throws as really a way of inflicting powerful effects onto monsters, and a way that is relatively quick for the system. And there's another added benefit to this. It kind of depends how martial characters are expected to behave in combat. Instead of a weapon user constantly relying on an attack roll to deal with an enemy, they will have the option to cause damage based on a saving throw instead. Now, normally this isn't going to be quite as powerful an option for characters as making an attack roll. Attack rolls can crit, and there's numerous ways for increasing an attack roll bonus. However, if the enemy that you're fighting has very high armor class and you're picking a saving throw that they aren't necessarily going to be very good at, suddenly the martial character has these tactical options on what they can do. They could try going for the attack roll even though the armor class is very high, or they could go for a saving throw, and potentially that might not cause as much damage, but they have the ability to cause additional effects on that creature. Suddenly our fighters, barbarians, monks, they aren't just relying on brute force to keep hitting something until something goes down. They can try and impose other effects and deal damage alongside those effects. Now, this might all raise a question for some people. If you're replacing an attack with a saving throw, how's that going to interact with something like advantage, disadvantage, or potentially cover? And for that, you're actually going to need to check out my interpretation of Weapon Masteries in the next video. Although, if you do want to find out a bit more about Weapon Masteries in your own time, I've got a link down in the video below. Follow it for Weapon Masteries and you'll be able to see how the system works early. Then we've got the problem that Weapon Masteries locks players into using particular weapon choices, and this is a really easy problem to fix. We see the solution in how the fighter engages with weapon mastery at higher levels. Rather than depending upon a particular weapon type to use a weapon mastery, they instead have their weapon masteries depend on the weapon properties. For me, this approach to weapon masteries makes much more sense universally, because in actuality the way we distinguish between different weapon types in D&D is completely and utterly arbitrary. If you look at the broad spectrum of different swords out there, there's a continuum of different design choices you have. You've got long swords like the katana, which are slender and agile, worthy of being finesse weapons, frankly. And then you got the much broader half swords, for example, which are, going to be moving towards maybe being a short sword, or at the extreme end of a long sword, you get this kind of halfway house between it being a long sword and a great sword. You've also at the low end got stuff like short swords, which are incredibly broad and short-bladed, like the Roman gladius, which in terms of the expected damage you'd expect them to do, it'd be something closer to what you'd have from a longsword. But in that case, you won't necessarily expect them to have the finesse weapon property. What describes, defines, and differentiates weapons from each other isn't these names that have been placed arbitrarily on them, but it's really the weapon's properties. If we define masteries by the weapon properties, suddenly players could be much more free in how they engage with these abilities. For example, a mastery which relies on the bludgeoning property. I don't know, maybe it has this push-like effect that it can create. Well, a character doesn't necessarily have to use a warhammer for that. They could maybe use a quarterstaff instead, or an unarmed strike, or a light hammer. A player with a weapon mastery that does this pushing effect isn't just going to be great with warhammer. They're going to instinctively know how to get the most out of all weapons that deal bludgeoning damage. And the game has already effectively trialled this approach with the bludgeoner, slasher, and piercer feats. And while not all of these feats were great, I think Crusher tended to be the most popular one. Each of these feats inspired a lot of creativity in how they could be used and combined, not only with different weapon types, but also spells. I feel like the Weapon Masteries feature, in whatever form it takes, really needs to take this approach, as locking players into choosing very specific weapons, I feel only solves one problem, and that is a problem that Dungeons & Dragons creators have made for themselves, and that is making their weapons too alike to each other. And really, what you need to do is just focus on making the weapon properties feel more distinct from each other. Let's look at that issue I discussed with Weapon Masteries not being an optional system. I feel whatever iteration of Weapon Masteries is out there needs to be optional for players to engage with, since in creating added interest for martial characters we are necessarily having to increase the complexity of the game. And I feel like the best on-ramp for something like this is making something like Weapon Masteries a feat. Feats can be thought of as these modular set of rules within the game, which only apply when a character has actually taken that particular feat. This empowers players to engage with those particular rules at their choosing. The more feats a player takes, the more rich but also complex the game becomes. And this is great for experienced players who want that complexity in their game, but it's also great for players who just want a simpler experience, and maybe rather than take that feat, they really would just prefer to take a +2 to their strength. And while Wizards of the Coast seem to have the impression that only something like around 50% of the player base actually use the feat system, I think we can all agree that result feels sus. The majority of players who I've talked to and who have played the game for any reasonable length of time do use feats. I think the only answer for why WotC have the impression that feats are maybe used only 50% of the time is they've done some bad statistics. They've maybe considered all the players who are trying to make a character but have maybe not bought the player's handbook. They're just using the free version of D&D Beyond, and I do really feel like they've been misinformed on this feature. However, I can see one big issue with this, and that is the perception that this will create some kind of feat tax for martial classes. To remedy this, there are other approaches we can think of to introduce a system like Weapon Masteries. Firstly, we could make it a first level feat rather than a feat that's quite a 4th level. First level feats are relatively cheap in terms of how much opportunity cost they ask for players, and it's something that they can also get at first level, so it's very easy to get into it from very low levels. I would think that something like a first level feat would maybe grant a player proficiency bonus number of weapon masteries as they level up. This means the player would start with 2 weapon masteries, and that's pretty manageable for the start. They've only got 2 choices to make at that point. And I like the idea of a character who's chosen to take weapon masteries developing in their craft more and more as they progress through the campaign, in a similar way to how spellcasters learn additional spells as they progress. Another option, instead of making it a first level feat, is to actually make weapon masteries a fighting style option. Again, this is a pretty cheap opportunity cost, and in my opinion, fighting style options should be about the same level of power as what a first level feat offers. Martial classes like the Fighter, Paladin and Ranger all gain access to fighting styles, and while I can see new players gravitating towards the much simpler bonuses, such as the +2 damage from Duelist, I can see the more experienced players gravitating towards these tactical options the Weapon Masteries offer. Now, this does raise a question. If you're just trading out a feat or a fighting style for these weapon masteries, you're not really creating additional power for the classes, you're more side grading them. And this, I think, comes into my own personal design philosophy around weapon masteries. I don't think the power of martial classes should rest on the shoulders of introducing a complex system to the game. I don't think players should be asked to learn many additional rules or asked to slow down the game just to make their class feel more powerful. I think the way that we make martial classes more powerful isn't by introducing these complex systems, but it's actually by just making the numbers in the base class bigger, or letting them use their abilities more often. You'll see a lot of this approach in how I'm approaching the classes in my Fixing 5e series, the most recent video of which was how I fixed the monk. You can see the first viewing maybe up here, but let's carry on. And then there's the other option, and that is to make Weapon Masteries this kind of half feat option. If you reach level 4 and you take a Weapon Mastery, I think that given that it's about the same level of strength as a first level feat, then really you should be getting that initial first level feat's worth of abilities, and also getting a +1 to an ability score of your choice. This makes the investment of taking Weapon Masteries just that much smaller. And if you've already picked up Weapon Masteries from something like Fighting Style, for example, then maybe this just gives you more Weapon Masteries. This means that, potentially you'd have to be creating quite a long list of different weapon masteries, such that maybe by the time you get to level 20 and you've got like a 6 proficiency bonus, you'll need at least 12 different weapon masteries, so otherwise you start to get to the limit of how many weapon masteries you can use. Alright, let's get to that other problem of weapon masteries sometimes just not being as good as others. I do think perfect balance is always going to be an impossible task. However, I'm pretty confident that with care, weapon masteries can be made more balanced. And a big part of WotC's problem in the balance department is their fear, their aversion to creating penalties on attacks. They are seemingly afraid to take that same design approach that Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter had, in that they have a penalty to create a powerful effect. And I think this makes some sense. I believe that WotC are putting all their eggs in the Weapon Masteries basket as a way to solve the power discrepancy between martials and casters. And so, taking power away from them to give them more flexibility is kind of counter to that approach. However, if we accept that the power of martials needs to come from the class itself, and not from a complex additional system, then I think we are actually more free in our ability to add these penalties onto weapon attacks, so that then we can offset that with powerful effects. And then this last problem, Weapon Masteries are incompatible with other class features. I talked about this problem briefly, but let's cover it again. If we take the attack tag away from certain Weapon Masteries, suddenly we are able to do effects like knocking prone without them stacking on top of a lot of additional effects. Okay, that about covers all my fixes for the Weapon Mastery system. As I said, if you wanted to explore these Weapon Mastery fixes early, before my next video, go ahead and look in the links below. All of the Freedom Fantasy system is being released under CC by 4, Creative Commons 4, and is free to access. It is free to utilize with appropriate attribution. So hey, go ahead and take a look. Feel free to discuss that or just the fixes I've proposed in this video below, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Have a great day.